Turning now to Ambassador Bloomfield, thank you so much for making this journey across the pond here to Europe. Ambassador Bloomfield, you've conducted really extensive research on this subject, but you've also been the author of several books in this regard. In one of your numerous speeches, I'd just like to quote from one of your speeches at an event where you asked the question, why do they keep repeating these allegations and these falsehoods? Why are they seeking to discredit the NCRI and the MEK? And your answer at this particular meeting was, the reason is always the same, to keep a weak and illegitimate regime in power. And I was wondering whether you would like to elaborate on the answer that you gave at this particular meeting, but also the connection between policy and disinformation.
Well, thank you very much, Azadeh, and it's an honor to be with all of you and with these distinguished co-panelists. I'm delighted to take that question. As you said, a dozen years ago, I started looking at this issue, just looking at allegations independently, because everything I saw on the web, I was the chairman of a think tank, and I looked at all the other think tanks, and they said the exact same thing, almost word for word. Don't go near them, they're terrorists, they killed Americans, they're Marxists, they're strange, stay away from them, don't trust them. And then I looked into the source documents from the time frames involved, 1979, 1980, 81, even going back to the early 70s and the 60s. And I would find differences and said, wait a minute, this isn't what really happened. And these few early moments turned into one chapter after another of a different story, an untold story, to the point where I would say two things. One, there's an entirely wrong narrative about the resistance and about the regime. And two, it's still believed by many people in Washington, and it's still repeated by most of the major media. There is a psychological reason for that. They want to hear the White House or the State Department say it first before they put it in the headline of their story, but the story lives on. And so I've thought about this, and here are my thoughts. This is an American view. One is that, you know, when your child lies to you, you know they're lying. But this disinformation has been successful. What's the difference? And it seems to me that one party is going to try to deceive, but it only works if the other party wants to believe. And I think that my view of this is a tale of two cities, of Tehran and Washington. And I think that the formative event that has consequences that even I have not fully unpacked was the hostage crisis. It traumatized the United States. It, for the first time, seized the entire US media daily for 444 days. And two things came, maybe three things came from that. One, we didn't focus on anything else. Two, when it was over, no one wanted to hear the word Iran in the US anymore. We were done with it. We were tired of it. And three, Ayatollah Khomeini and his people learned something about the Americans. And so let me start with that. What did they learn? They learned that the Americans had been shocked. They tried to rescue the hostages. It didn't work. They could be cowed into submission, into keeping their distance. Well, that escalated to Lebanon. I was the desk officer for the Pentagon when the Marines were bombed, when the embassies were bombed, when the hostages were taken, the TW-847. Rich Higgins, we helped send him there, a Marine. He was murdered. All of these traumatic events happened. They learned from that it actually works. Terrorism works. If they punch you in the face, you might steer clear. And when we got tired of that, along came the secret nuclear program, which all of a sudden became the one and only thing that matters, the nuclear program. I'll get to the disinformation in a minute, but even as the nuclear issue suddenly loses a little currency, now let's back and seize some hostages. Let's take this kindly Belgian aid worker, a Norwegian refugee fund, and let's, if they aren't scared by 40 years in prison, maybe 74 lashes will really scare them, and it did. And they got their spy back, Assadi, from Belgium by trading a hostage. That, I think, is part of the story of disinformation. When we look at China, the United States doesn't have any problem saying China's the pacing threat. You know, we're going to build toward China. We're doing all these things to get ready for deterrence, extended deterrence with China. When it comes to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, there's no two versions of Putin. Some people may have sympathy for him, not very many anymore. You know, what he has done to violate the UN Charter and do so much harm to the Ukrainians. When it comes to Iran, we don't have a narrative. We don't have a unified story of what happened. We missed a whole lot of formative things that happened. We didn't understand in Washington who is the MEK. We didn't know it was a student movement. They still call them Marxists. They were studying social equity issues that Marx wrote about. I studied Marx in college, but they didn't embrace Marx's, you know, political agenda of totalitarian rule. They never embraced that. And in fact, the Shah was a very good propagandist. When they saw left-wing, non-Islamic violent student radicals, they may not even have been students, they lumped them all together. They're all mujahideen. These are all crazy. And they scared the population against the young radicals. And so everyone was lumped into this business that they're Marxists, they're extremists, they killed the Americans. Well, folks, they didn't kill the Americans. Masoud Rajavi's MEK never killed the Americans. They had nothing to do with it. In fact, they opposed the people who did. And there was blood in the streets. Sharif University is named after an MEK person who was killed by the leftist extremists who killed the Americans. And so we missed the story. We didn't see that there was a season of politics where Madame Rajavi ran for office. She won a lot of votes, but was then disqualified. Ayatollah Khomeini wanted Masoud Rajavi and the MEK students, these educated, young, bright men and women, he wanted them as part of his movement. They were with him in Paris. He talked about democracy. He never said anything about Velayat-e-Faqih. He never said, we're going to have a totalitarian one-man rule that is divinely ordained by the 12th Imam of the Prophet. He never said that until he got to Tehran. And then suddenly he had this constitution. People were afraid of the Basij beating people up in the street and tearing down printing machines and whatnot. Masoud Rajavi and his supporters, your families, stood their ground and continued to show up for the rallies. And it boiled, as you know, on June 20th, 1981, the reign of terror began. They shot their way to power. They stole the revolution that never belonged to them. The Americans missed this story. So, of course, if you see that you've gotten away with all of this, then you can propagate all sorts of narratives that can be believed. I studied the terrorism reports for 19 years out of the State Department. For the first part, they weren't so bad. But then along came the time when they put the MEK on the terrorism list in 1987. As Director Free just explained, the FBI wasn't consulted. It had nothing to do with a dossier of terrorism. The terrorism reports changed overnight. And soon, terrible events that had been attributed to upwards of 7 different groups, like the bombing against the Islamic Revolutionary Party that injured Ali Khamenei's arm and killed Beheshti. The MEK was never a suspect when that happened, and they never claimed it, as they did with some of their other armed resistance activities over 20 years. But after a while, all of these things were the MEK. It was all the MEK, and it showed up in the US State Department report. And of course, the newspapers printed it. So now time has gone on, and I have to say, we were right all along. I thought that our research was a little bit risky. You know, we're trying to say that we have different facts than the governments of the West are repeating. We can sit here now in 2023 and say, we have been right all along. All of you have been right all along. The narrative that we uncovered, the narrative that I got by asking questions, and others have gotten, that Strawn Stevenson's books have described so well, was all true. And so I think I want to finish by saying, disinformation won't work so well if the media keeps repeating it. So my appeal to you and to all the journalists here is that you must stop repeating things that you now know are untrue. You must stop. And we will keep telling you to stop. You cannot repeat these false narratives. You now know that the people who have left the MEK and said, I was I was kept in a room and I was asked to confess my sins and I was tortured and I couldn't leave. You know that they're on the payroll of the Ministry of Intelligence. Read the Antwerp court report when Assadollah Assadi was indicted. I will give it to you if you ask me for a copy. I emailed it to myself. This will describe the operation of Section 312 of the Ministry of Intelligence and Security across Europe, across the United States, across Canada. We are being influenced by agents of influence in our midst, in the universities, in the think tanks, and in some places in government. I think we can fix this, but we have to stand up for the truth. We have to point a finger. We have to demand that the media organizations have professional pride, do the brave thing. You're not going to get any more visas to Tehran. Sorry. Tell the truth. And when we do that, the regime will be exposed as the weak and illegitimate entity of ruthless and unprincipled people that they surely are. Well, I think, thank you very much, Azadeh. I think we've seen, everyone has described a wall of propaganda that has been put up, a Berlin Wall, if you will. A few years ago, Madame Rajavi called it an obscuring curtain. Some of you may remember her saying that at Ashraf 3. It's the same concept. If this weren't Iran, if we weren't, as an American, traumatized by the hostage crisis and the terrorism and the nuclear proliferation, and we could just simply look at what was going on. Here you have an extremely well-organized movement with, by the way, very credible intelligence files. They've kept the file on this regime from day one. No one else has done that, to my knowledge. Maybe Director Free can correct me on that. There are governments that come to the NCRI and say, can you answer this, can you answer that? They have dossiers on people. I don't think we knew that Hossein Dagan, the first defense minister for Rouhani, was the brigadier who first trained Hezbollah to become fighters and who oversaw the operations that blew up the U.S. Embassy twice and blew up the U.S. Marines at Beirut Airport. And here he comes back in 2013, and we don't know who he is. I don't know how many women understand that Hassan Rouhani's job in February of 1979 was to go into the Department of the Army and enforce hijab on the women. So Rouhani might be a great moderate, but he's not a man of the hour. And the point being here, if you just look at the NCRI and the MEK, a non-violent movement that is entirely intellectual, as Ron Stevenson, the 10-point plan has described so well. And then look at what's happening in Iran, where not only the women, if I may put it that way, but the girls have all turned against this government and said, we can't have it. I think the young men of Iran should be our focus. The young men carrying the guns and taking the paychecks from the MOIS and from the Justice Ministry, in the jails, from the the Revolutionary Guards, the Quds Force. The young ones have to spend the rest of their lives looking into the eyes of the females of Iran. Good luck doing that if you don't find your honor and walk away from this regime.
Hear, hear.